Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gayle King.
Hi. Hello, people. How many people stayed up late last night? Okay. I was up till 11:02, which is very late for me on a school night. Very, very late. But I am so excited to be here. I'm a political junkie of the highest order. I have a TV in every single room of my house, including the bathroom, because I don't want to miss a thing. And last night was a night to stay up late. The ballroom, as you know, wasn't the only place that they hand out the winners and losers. Let's talk about Iowa, where things didn't quite play out as everybody had predicted. That's what they say about the polls. I saw Sarah Palin. I never thought I'd be quoting Sarah Palin, but she said the only thing good about a poll is when it's in your garage or your bathroom. Figure that one out. Joining us to discuss last night's caucus results, what they mean for New Hampshire, and, oh, by the way, for the leadership of the free world, are three of the top magazine journalists in the business. These guys are at the top of their game. I give you Nancy Gibbs, who I often email to say, your cover again was knockout. Jonathan Chait, who you all know, and Michael Kinsley, along with the moderator, a son of the live free or die state, a man who seems to keep finding new ways to be ridiculously good at his job. Host of the Late Night with Seth Meyers, that's Mr. Seth Meyers himself. A round of applause, please. Which, by the way, guys, Seth is expecting his first baby. Well, his lovely wife, Mrs. Meyers, is expecting the first baby in April. And I said, Seth, you know, Gayle is a unisex name. Do with it what you will. If you don't like that, I offer you Shaniqua or Raheem. It goes very well with Meyers. You're welcome, Seth.
They're both family names.
They're both family names. I thought so. So the first votes have been counted in a very crowded primary race that has been dramatic, expensive, unpredictable, and at times, as the kids of today say, cray-cray, sometimes even profane. So we have the results on the screen for you, but this just in, as we were walking out, they said the Washington Post has already called it for Hillary. If you could get any closer than this, the whisker-thin margin is 49.8% for her, 49.6% for Bernie Sanders. And if you were watching CBS This Morning, and I hope you were, you know that some of the races were decided by the flip of a coin, which I don't understand why that's happening in 2016, but some of the races were so close that they were dead even that they literally flipped a coin to decide who was going to win. Unlikely candidates from nowhere near the party's mainstream have struck a chord with the voters, it seems, tapping into the anger, the frustration with the so-called establishment. The heir apparent from a political dynasty has seen his poll numbers drop. Everybody's asking, what in the world happened to Jeb Bush? And a presumed favorite has had to dig in deep to her war chest yet again to deal with the upstart challenger, and he is an upstart at 74 years old, the Democratic Socialist from Burlington, Vermont, Bernie Sanders. So last night, over 300,000 voters and nearly as many reporters showed up. And we kept hearing, if you have a big turnout, if you have a big turnout, if you have a big turnout, it's going to be Bernie. If you have a big turnout, it's going to be Donald Trump. That didn't happen. At almost 1,700 precincts all across Iowa. And what did they actually do in the churches, the school gyms, and the places like the Old Country Seat Bar and Grill in Mitchell? I can tell you. First of all, these dedicated voters turned out on the Republican side, set a record with over 185,000 caucus goers, and that number is huge. The final Democratic tally still isn't in yet, but they say the grand total is expected to double the 2012 turnout. The caucus process tends to require a higher level of devotion to a candidate than voting in a general election. And it says that they really took it very, very seriously in Iowa this year. The Democrats are even known to have prolonged debates and must physically caucus by standing in groups with fellow supporters of a given candidate. And the GOP, as you probably know, operates with minimal fanfare and secret ballots. And last night, both parties veered off the script big time. They humbled, I saw Donald Trump had done an interview with, on Face the Nation with John Dickerson, and John said, you know, when you use the word humility, he had gone to a church service, and the sermon was humility. And John said, you know, when they think about you, most people don't use the word humility. And Donald Trump said, no, I'm very humble. I am a very humble man. People just don't know that about me, but trust me, I have a lot of humility. And people say last night they saw that as he was delivering his speech. A humbled brush billionaire reality TV star who was polling 7 points ahead of Ted Cruz the day before the caucuses. And they just barely favored Hillary over Bernie, who was 3 points ahead the day before. And it says this morning that Hillary Clinton is breathing a huge sigh of relief, although they say that they're also worried in the Clinton camp. The Washington Post says that the results certainly indicate this is going to be a prolonged democratic process. And if you're watching politics, I'm thinking this is fun. On the Democratic side, women, as you might expect, favored Hillary Clinton, while the young voters overwhelmingly turned out for Bernie Sanders. He took 84% of the voters from the ages of 17 to 29, and 58% of those from 30 to 44. I'm so glad that 30 to 44 is considered young voting. I like that. I'm thinking, I stand here at 61 and I'm thinking 55 is young people. Among GOP voters who consider themselves very conservative, 44% voted for Cruz, which is more double than Trump's total, and it's even more than Trump and Rubio together. What I think is so interesting about this is Marco Rubio came in third place. And if you heard him speak yesterday, they said he was giving a victory speech. And we've heard that in the Republican establishment that they're secretly breathing a sigh of relief because it shows there is another candidate out there, but there's certainly more to come. The top issues for the voters included terrorism, the economy, but there's a new book out by Peter Berger that says, for those of us who are worried about terrorism, and I certainly am because it's in the news all the time, you think, are we next, are we next? He said, we are more likely to be shot on the streets in America by a fellow American than we are to be attacked by terrorists. That's something to think about. But as the caucus results often raise more questions than they answer about voter preference, the demographics did not mirror the country's yesterday. 91% of the Democratic caucus goers are white people. Sort of reminds me of the Oscars. 97% of the Republicans. But I like white people. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. I like them. Iowa's priorities on the issues are not always aligned either. In fact, Iowa doesn't have a good track record, by the way, picking the eventual nominees. And you'll see on the slide in just a second their record on that. Since 1972, the caucuses haven't predicted the eventual nominee only 3 out of 7 times. For the GOP, when the party didn't even have an incumbent, and slightly better, but still not so great for the Democrats. 5 out of 8 times for Democrats without an incumbent. So that puts the Iowa caucus members George H.W. Bush, Bob Dole, Mike Huckabee, Rick Santorum, Dick Gephardt, Tom Harkin, and Edmund Muskie in an elite, if you could say, a very odd kind of club. In other words, winners often, as Donald Trump uses often, losers. So why do we care? Why did campaigns and their super PACs spend over $70 million on ads in Iowa alone? I have a friend who lives in Iowa, and she said, I got sick of looking at TV. I got sick of picking up the phone. Everywhere you went, there was somebody trying to sell us something. So I'm sure they're glad it's over. It's a litmus test of sorts, this first of the election. And a bump in Iowa, as you know, can swing the momentum in favor of a candidate with a previously tepid poll numbers. And since getting supporters to caucus takes a whole lot of effort, Iowa is a test campaign as much as anything. It can breathe new life into a campaign, and more importantly, it could end it. As you know, Mike Huckabee and Martin O'Malley know all too well. Mike Huckabee said, I thought this was funny, he goes, people are sick of me, I can take the hint, I'm leaving. So as we look ahead to the nation's first primary on February 9th, in New Hampshire, that's next Tuesday, in New Hampshire, where Donald Trump and Sanders are leading in the polls before last night, what can we and the candidates learn from the results in Iowa? Well, you're in very good hands because Seth and Michael and Nancy and Jonathan are going to try to make sense of it all. They're going to try to figure it out. Thank you. I'll see you out there.
Thank you, Gayle. All right, so effectively we have 5 candidates now, 2 on the Democratic side, 3 on the Republican side, it seems like. Of those 5 people, who rank them from 1 to 5 based on how happy they were last night to how upset they were. So of the 3 Republicans, the top 3, and Hillary and Bernie, who would you say is happiest after last night?
Rubio is clearly happy. Trump is the least happy, and Cruz is moderately happy.
I'd say Cruz would probably be the happiest because he was facing the possible near-death experience if he didn't beat Trump, but he did. So he's got new life that he was seeming to wane in the weeks before Iowa, but he's completely come roaring back.
Yeah, I could argue that perversely that Hillary is the happiest, because if Bernie Sanders cannot win in Iowa, then you really have to wonder down the road where he's going to be stronger than in a state which is as aligned with his message and his motives and the momentum that he had.
Is it safe to say that outside Iowa, New Hampshire, after Vermont, that there is not a better state for Bernie Sanders as far as demographic layout?
Those are the three. You named the best three states.
Yeah.
You probably saw that in terms of the percentage of the electorate that's composed of white liberals, which is his base. Those are the three states that are the best. But two of those three are the first two states that are voting. So, I mean, other than Vermont, he couldn't have started with two better ones. So his hope is that this catapults him to more success. And so people outside the voting groups who supported him now will see the fact that he tied her in Iowa, probably beats her in New Hampshire, and think of him as a winner and come to his side. That's his scenario.
Bernie Sanders is not going to be president of the United States. If he continues to do almost as well as Hillary or beat her in places, someone else will come in.
You think someone who is currently not in the race will jump in if Bernie?
Yeah, I would think, because he's just not going to be president.
Now this is interesting, because I would think that supporters of Bernie would say that the press refers to his electability probably more than any other candidate. Certainly Trump, we hear a lot about electability. Is there something depressing if you are a Bernie Sanders supporter that you're constantly being told, well, the problem with your candidate is even though he runs in a dead heat in Iowa caucus, essentially, he's never going to be president, so just give up hope?
Well, this is where Republicans are sharper than Democrats, because they end up usually with somebody who is well, the polls showed this morning that Republicans ranked electability as the highest goal.
Now, I want to talk about polls real quick, because we did something on my show where I sat down with an Iowa phone book for 3 hours and called people to ask them who they were voting for president. I called 200 people. 193 were either not home or hung up on me. 3 said Clinton, 3 said Trump, 1 said Rubio. That was exhausting. Can we trust polls anymore because of the very fact of how they're conducted and who's answering their phone?
We should not have been trusting them at any point, given how wrong they have proven to be in not just in recent American races, in every important election anywhere in the free world. They have been fantastically wrong. And so it is ironic that we are more dependent on them in a sense for shaping the narrative, which takes all the fun out of it.
And it's harder to poll caucuses than primaries, and it's harder to poll primaries than it is to poll the general election. So you can't draw broad conclusions about polling from the failure of a caucus state, because everyone would tell you that polling a caucus is just the hardest thing you can do.
Well, caucuses, that's just one of the things that's wrong with caucuses, as a way of democracy. I mean, caucuses were invented in 1976 by a journalist named R.W. Apple of the New York Times, who they started them in 72, no one paid any attention. Then in 76, he decided he was going to make a major deal out of them, and he was the most influential political journalist of the time, and as a consequence, they became a big deal. And that's why everybody was in Iowa yesterday.
So love of polls may be Donald Trump's Achilles heel, because he's the one who kept on talking about the polls all the time and how he was leading. And in any other time, the fact that Donald Trump, of all people, who is perhaps the candidate least suited to the Iowa electorate, got more votes than any Republican candidate in the history of the Iowa caucuses, except for one, that's Ted Cruz, would be an incredible story, and could be, I mean, if Marco Rubio can spin third as a victory, Donald Trump surely could have spun second as a victory had he not had so much of his run-up been about how he's going to win because look at the polls. Look at the polls.
My theory with Trump in the polls was telling a pollster you were voting for Donald Trump was a very cathartic thing to do. And it's a little bit like having a few drinks at the bar and telling your friend the next time my boss tells me to work weekends, I'm going to tell him to F off. But then when the time comes, you realize, no, I need this job. And when it's actually time to vote for Donald Trump, it's a little bit harder than saying, I'm going to vote for that guy. Do you think we're going to see that? Obviously, it's easier to vote in New Hampshire because it's a primary. You go into a booth. You don't have to stand in a gym and huddle around in packs. Caucuses are stupid, right? You would agree, Michael?
Stupid, yeah.
Yeah, they're dumb.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good.
completely.
So that's the boy from New Hampshire.
Well, I'm just saying we have it figured out. Do you think the polling on Trump, because it's a primary, will be closer to what it's saying now than it was in Iowa?
I think Nancy's point addressed that a bit in the sense that his voters turned out. It's not that people melted away. It's just that Cruz brought out way more people than anybody expected on his side. He just got a huge evangelical turnout.
I mean, Trump had outsourced his get out the vote to marketing firms. He was not seriously playing in Iowa until it gotten into his head about 2 weeks ago that, hey, I could really win this thing. Had he not made that expectations pivot, if he had been saying all along, gee, it would be really great if I were in the top 3, think how different the conversation would be this morning.
When we talk about evangelicals in Iowa, the last 2 GOP winners, when you look at Huckabee, Santorum, very little bounce going into New Hampshire. Can we expect the same for Cruz? Is the bounce Rubio's going into New Hampshire as opposed to Cruz?
I would say yes. I mean, look at Rick Santorum, who a mere 48 months ago won the Iowa caucuses, came dead last in a field of 10, which is quite something.
Yeah.
So, and Huckabee would say the same. And so yes, I think it's and also New Hampshire is one of the most secular states in the country, coming out of Iowa, which is one of the most sacred. There is no better state for Ted Cruz than Iowa as well. So
Cruz is, I think, as people take a closer look at him, gonna sink because he's unpleasant. I mean that shouldn't matter, but I think it's hard to get elected if you're just sort of unpleasant, you know.
Richard Nixon pulled it off.
Yes, well, Nixon's the last one I could think of before.
Has Trump been good for Cruz because so much focus has been on the unpleasantness of Donald Trump that people have sort of failed to notice, hey, this guy's also unpleasant?
That's a good theory.
Yeah.
So my theory of this is that the Republican establishment is rationally afraid of Donald Trump because he's a guy who has no demonstrated commitment to the conservative movement and their politics or anything beyond his own self-promotion and his own ego. They're irrationally afraid of Ted Cruz. They just hate him so much because he's such a jerk, but they're not focusing on the fact that Ted Cruz was basically raised from birth to enact the conservative movement. His father was a conservative activist who brought this child up basically on Reagan speeches and right-wing texts. And the fact that he's such an unpleasant jerk about his advancing his agenda, I think is blinding a lot of these people to the fact that he's truly on their side in a way that Trump isn't.
Now, you, Michael, you wrote an article about the way the press dealt with Trump. You called Trump a buffoon, and you feel like the press has let him off the hook a little bit and has taken him too seriously.
Well, you could say the press has been bad to him, but in a way, the press has been good to him. I think that he has gotten more ink than anybody else, and he's also gotten. You can say anything you want in the New York Times about Donald Trump and any other supposedly respectable newspaper. I'm not saying the Times isn't respectable, but it's phenomenal how open the hatred of Trump is among. It's inspiring, you could say, among journalists.
Now, did it hurt any of your feelings when Ted Cruz referred to New York values and it actually helped him in Iowa?
Well, wasn't that, one moment when even the Trump haters at the New York Times could find something to love in the way Trump answered that? I think anyone who was reminded about this city and its spirit after 9/11 was powerfully moved by that. So I don't know that New Yorkers' feelings are hurt easily, though. So I don't think Mr.
Yeah, I don't think
Cruz-
so either. Now, Donald Trump, we talked about this backstage. I guess this was 2013. He called you a no-talent, illiterate hack. He's often referred to me as a third-rate talent, which I guess is better.
Yeah, right. I dream of being a third-rate talent.
One day.
Yeah.
I hope you aspire.
I'm trying
I
to
hope
come
one
up
day
to
you
fourth.
can meet me at the top of the mountain there. How have you? Look, with my job, the Donald Trump candidacy has been fantastic.
Yeah.
This has been a wonderful time for all of us that do late-night comedy. Has it been enjoyable for those of you who write about politics, or is there something daunting about trying to decide how to cover a campaign like this, which is sort of unlike any that's come before it?
I've really liked it a lot because Trump is something completely different. He's different substance-wise, and he's different stylistically. He's different in style because he runs like a pundit. He doesn't run like he's part of the race. He runs like he's commenting on the race. And he gets up and he talks about the polls, and he'll talk in a meta way about his attacks. He'll say, like, that tagline I used on Jeb Bush, low energy, it's really sticking. It's really hurting him. You know, you don't see candidates talking like they're a CNN talking head describing their own race. Right? It's like someone in, the baseball game who's announcing the game as they're playing. You don't see that. So that's just weird and fun. But, substantively, he's really activated a huge part of the Republican base. Basically, the modus operandi of this party has been to mobilize voters on the basis of cultural identity. Some form of nationalism. Sometimes it takes a foreign policy element. Sometimes there's a social policy element. But it's basically, we are a certain kind of Americans are threatened by outsiders. And you bring them to the polls, and then the agenda that is then enacted is basically the 1% agenda. It's basically, okay, great, you voted for us, good job. Now we're going to cut taxes, at the top rate, and we're going to deregulate Wall Street, and we're going to make sure that you can emit greenhouse gas emissions. And Trump's voters are basically tired of this con. He's basically saying, in very weird, incoherent ways, he's basically saying, you've been taken advantage of, and he's not pushing the same kind of deal. Now, we don't know what his deal is, but he seems to be more attuned to the actual concerns that these constituents have been voting for all these years than the kind of bait and switch game that the party's been playing for 3 decades.
And I would even go further. I agree with that. I love anyone who surprises us and proves us wrong repeatedly. I think that's great for journalism and comedy and democracy. But it's the last, I think, that's the most important. Who would have imagined that you would have 24 million people tuning into a primary debate in August? That you would have, in the case of Bernie Sanders, 800,000 people donating an average of $27 apiece. That we are seeing participation and engagement and focus at levels that we have not seen in any election in our lifetimes. And so at a time when we all have seen all sorts of surveys that talk about how dispirited people are about the state of American democracy, the fact that they are acting as though they think they can fix that and do something about it by coming out, by caucusing, by donating, by watching debates is, I think, something that's truly encouraging to watch wherever you come down about who you would like to see president. The fact that there is a vibrancy and intensity about this campaign, I think, is a very healthy sign for the body politic.
So, Nancy, what's going to happen when all these people realize that Trump or anybody else does not have any solution to their problems?
Well, or when they realize that even if they elect a president whose solutions they understand and agree with, can't get anything through a Congress. I think what we're seeing, which is so interesting, is a loss of faith in representative democracy and a rise in faith in direct democracy. And by direct democracy, I mean the most successful candidates right now are cutting out the donors, cutting out the parties, cutting out the media to the extent that they possibly can, and having a direct engagement with voters. And so how that translates once you have a new president in office, I think is one of the most interesting questions of our time, because if you don't do anything about legislatures and about what it is actually possible to enact, and this is Hillary Clinton's whole argument, then you can have the best ideas and the best policies and the best proposals in the world, and they will go nowhere.
But I think she's totally right about that, and I think the problem, as Michael's alluding to, is if this whole movement is aimed at the presidency, then, okay, imagine Bernie Sanders. I know you don't want to imagine it, but let's imagine hypothetically that Bernie Sanders becomes president somehow.
It's fun to imagine.
Right. It would be
Yeah.
very fun to imagine. He's got a Republican House dealing with him, so they don't want to go as far left as Clinton's policy, so they're not going to go even further left. They want to go to the right. So he doesn't really have an answer to that other than to talk about this political revolution. But I don't really see any specific way in which this political revolution is taking effect except working at the presidential level.
Well, we've heard so much about the angry electorate. What are they angry at? Especially the Republican electorate. They're angry that you have all of these candidates who have run on the promise that they would overturn Obamacare and that they would balance the budget and that they would be fiscally responsible and do all of these things that they have, for all the reasons we know, not been able to do. And so that's one of the reasons people are angry. I'm hard-pressed to see, no matter who it is, of all of these candidates, how the next president really changes that dynamic.
I think it's not just interesting what will happen when people realize that Trump doesn't have a plan, hypothetically, but when Trump realizes he has to live in Washington, D.C., because I can't imagine
in a really
he's
little
thought about
house
that yet.
compared
Yeah.
to-
He can't change that?
I bet that would be one of the first things
builder.
he'd try to pass. You mentioned the debates, and you mentioned 24 million people in August. That was, of course, a GOP debate. Does Bernie Sanders have a gripe with the way the DNC has scheduled the debates on sort of, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if one was happening right now. They put them on weekends. They put them on holiday weekends. They put them on weird times. Yeah.
So the Republican audience has increased 500%. The Democratic debate audience has still doubled. And so it is not that, yes, the way they have scheduled them has been a travesty. It'll be interesting to see if that changes now. I think that's a legitimate point to make. But I'm also, given just the sheer vibrancy and oddness of the Republican field, I'm not sure there was any way that the Democrats had a chance of.
Sure.
No, but he's right. I mean, Clinton basically rigged the game with the Democratic Party to hold down the debates because they thought they just needed to avoid opportunities for her to lose her huge lead. And he's right that it's basically been bad for everybody.
Well, this whole election is basically about people who haven't done anything, and the less you do, the less you talk, the less likely it is that you're going to say something bad. You know, so that's smart.
It's interesting. Now, obviously, the press has covered Trump. We're guilty of it on my show as well. We've certainly paid more attention to Trump than everybody else, and then Hillary, and then sort of a mix of everyone else. Are candidates right to say, hey, how come we're not getting equal coverage? Or is fairness, as far as how much you get coverage, a silly thing to get asked for? Like the press follows the story, or do you feel like the press has made too much of certain candidates and not enough of others?
Well, our premise is that the press can do no wrong. So, and I'm sure at the National Magazine conference.
Good room for it, yeah.
Surely blame the newspapers, though.
Yeah. But, well, what was the question?
Well, no, I mean, is it, when Rand Paul says, how come none of the nightly shows talk about me? You know, how come I'm never on the news? Isn't the reason that you haven't done enough to garner enough attention? Is it fair to ask for an equal amount of attention to all these candidates, especially when on the Republican side you have so many who haven't even, garnered enough polling to show up at the main stage?
I don't know why they give as much attention as they do to a former neurosurgeon or a former governor of Maryland or any of them.
Yeah, I mean, I actually would say the problem is the opposite, is that some of these people have figured out a loophole that if you say you're running for president, you're entitled to a certain amount of free publicity, which you can then use to get yourself a talk show on Fox and sell books, when some of these people who've been running the last couple cycles clearly have no real intention of winning, but are just taking advantage of the free publicity. And if they don't get it, then they could berate the media and berate the debate moderators for not giving them their free publicity, when that's really all they want.
Is there a chance, when I said the happiest person, whether it was Cruz or whether it's Rubio, isn't it possible the two happiest people are Martin O'Malley and Mike Huckabee because they no longer have to do this?
Well, I think they both love it to excess. So I doubt they're all that happy.
It seems like it'd at least be a relief to know that you don't have to go talk to anybody in New Hampshire today. Jeb Bush, the worst use? I mean, we talk about the importance of campaign money and how politics are driven by money. Jeb Bush has done more to try to disprove this theory than anyone in political history. What went wrong with Jeb Bush's campaign, and at what point does Jeb Bush step away from this?
He's clearly going to go through New Hampshire. That's where he's got his biggest investment. I think he underrated the degree to which, after the collapse of the Bush administration, conservatives told a story where all their ideas were really fine. You just had this horrible man who had somehow smuggled himself into our party and into the White House, who had betrayed all our ideas, and it was really all on him. And once we get past George W. Bush and get back to having a real Republican, then all things will be right. And I think a lot of people in the party understood that this was a fairy tale that they were telling to absolve their ideas from any responsibility for the failure of those ideas. But I think Bush didn't understand that a lot of people really took this line seriously. That was coming from Fox News and Rush Limbaugh every day. And so they see another Bush, and they see that as a recipe for repeating these failures.
I also think in the last debate in Iowa really showed it when Trump was not there, that Trump wrong-footed Bush from the start. He just got under his skin in an extraordinary way to watch, and he didn't have his footing after that at any point until a debate where Trump wasn't there. And I don't underestimate the impact that ended up having on the perception of Jeb as a strong, competent, capable, the country will be safe in his hands kind of leader. None of that mattered when he was so obviously uncomfortable and unable to get a sentence out.
And you're totally right, because at the last debate, when Donald Trump wasn't there dunking his head in the toilet every time he opened his mouth, Jeb actually looked pretty good. And he thought, like, if he could have done this 5 times, you could see him getting some votes. But he was just so horribly bullied. And, I mean, you felt really bad and uncomfortable for him. But you're not going to, vote for a president out of pity. It's not that kind of job.
He was like a high schooler who the bully got suspended for a day, and he was just living it up down the hallway.
Exactly.
Looking back, obviously, with the results, it's easy to say, did Trump backing out of that last debate, was that costly, would you say? It certainly seemed to have helped Rubio shine in the last debate.
Cruz's internal polling suggests that hurt him. And what was interesting was that it was being spun as, in some ways, a really brilliant move, that it was a split screen night. A lot of the networks were covering Trump all on his own, looking like a leader with Huckabee and Santorum there. That was extraordinary. But it does look as though it did not sit well.
Mm-hmm. Over the course of however we have the next a week, how do you think Trump will start to frame Iowa? Because that, to me, will be very enjoyable. Like, will he go so far as to start telling New Hampshire voters that people in Iowa are losers? This is a theory I have, that he'll start saying that Rubio is a loser because Rubio was so happy about third place. I think you'll see Trump saying, like, I was disappointed with second. Rubio acting like he won the thing in third place. What a loser.
That's totally right. You should go to work for Trump as a line. No,
I think I'm in his head right now. I think I got it figured out.
That really works.
But do you think that's what, that to me is what has made this all so interesting is, when things happen to Trump or when things happen to other candidates, what path he takes next. Like, what do you think how will he start to frame this second place finish?
Well, he said he loved Iowa and wanted to even buy a farm in Iowa as opposed to buying the farm in Iowa. So it's, but the thing about that,
I found that to be the most ominous thing to say. I might buy a farm here. I thought was like, you've crossed me, and now I'm coming for your actual physical land.
Maybe after the Miss America contestants, age out of that job, they can have nice jobs on the Trump farm.
Yeah, I kind of see like Trump buys a farm and then just says, burn it to the ground, and just makes the people of Iowa watch.
But
I would visit the Trump farm.
Yeah.
I would bring my kids to see that.
I've heard it's the best farm.
I would love to know from you as a New Hampshire native what you think happens. New Hampshire loves to mess with Iowa, loves to overturn the results. It's a very different state. What do you think?
Well, and I think even you look back and when Obama won in 2008, he was actually polling ahead in New Hampshire after Iowa, and then Hillary came back and won. So I don't think winning in Iowa is necessarily helpful in New Hampshire. I would have said historically that a Kasich or a Christie would be the kind of candidates that would make a dent in New Hampshire, but I think right now they won't. It'll be interesting to see Rubio, to me, has to finish at least second. If he finishes third in New Hampshire as well, I think he's going to start looking like a candidate who is a third-place candidate. But I don't think New Hampshire will go for Cruz.
Is Kasich going to get his, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is Kasich going to get his 15 minutes now? Or is he over?
I think he's over. I think they'll give him 9 minutes. I think New Hampshire will buy him that much.
I mean, Cruz seems to have locked down the hardcore evangelical vote. So that's not real big in New Hampshire.
Which doesn't exist in New Hampshire, right?
Well, it exists some. I mean, if you get 15, 16%, it's possible that you could get a decent finish in that state with so many candidates splitting it up. If you're the only one, right, you're counter-programming the rest of the field that's all going for the typical New Hampshire voter. He's going for the atypical New Hampshire voter. He could actually do okay.
Is the primary process in this country insane? That every time we do it, we go Iowa, New Hampshire, right, South Carolina, which seem like very unique states that are in no way, shape, or form sort of indicative of what the demographics of this country are. And each state sort of makes candidates shift and change to try to curry favor within those electorates. Is it a crazy system? Is it a good system? I mean, it doesn't seem like there's any sense that it's going to change. What would you say to it?
I think the point about racial diversity is the most important one, that the unusual whiteness of Iowa and New Hampshire is the biggest disqualification. They have at least a plausible argument that being small states, they force the candidates to meet everyone and go shovel their snow, and then you've got these New Hampshire people who say, well, I've only talked to this guy 7 times, I'm not sure, he hasn't locked me down yet, and it's a wonderful little American thing. But you need some people who aren't white to be part of that experience, to have any kind of legitimacy, in my opinion. The problem is there aren't a lot of states that are diverse and tiny.
Right. I will say, growing up in New Hampshire, no one seems presidential when they're just hanging out in the coffee shop. Like we used to go to high school and you'd stop to get a coffee and like meet Paul Tsongas.
Right.
Yeah.
And he was like, I'd love your vote. And you'd be like, okay, but that's a little desperate.
But Paul Tsongas wouldn't have seemed presidential if he had been finishing his second term in
But
in
I will say, the other
II.
thing when I was doing my my very low rent polling of Iowa caucus voters, everyone in Iowa said they were thrilled that the candidates were leaving. They could not wait for them to get out of their state. And so I imagine there's something nice to being able to meet everybody, but I'm sure at some point you're like, oh no, Chris Christie's at the Applebee's, let's go eat somewhere else. What do we think about, you mentioned if Bernie was ahead, that's where you see somebody like Michael Bloomberg, but not if it's Hillary?
Not if it's Hillary.
Well, you said if Bernie Sanders was
if Sanders is, as he basically is now, equal to Hillary, I think there will be talk about someone coming in, and the only someone really around is Bloomberg.
It's a big country. A lot of people. A lot of people eligible to run.
Name 2. Plausible.
The people who want to run, then you narrow it down.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you think of anybody else who might jump into this thing?
You know, I think any really wealthy person could use that as a platform to run because I'm wealthy, therefore I'm successful, therefore I know how to get things done and solve problems. And if you don't have a political background, a lot of people would look at that as a plus. So if you really want to go through that and change your life in that way, I think there's a lot of people who have the money who could do it.
Except President John Connolly and President Ross Perot and any number of others have put the money.
Right.
I mean, the irony
President
that Donald
Forbes.
Trump has basically spent the least money. You know, he had the money to spend, but he didn't need to because of the amount of free media is kind of one of these incredible ironies. I thought you were going to say if, in the Hillary gets indicted or the special prosecutor gets named version that what's John Kerry thinking, I thought that's where you were.
We talked about how last night was a relief for Hillary. Even she said, did you find it strange during her victory speech? She even said, with a sigh of relief. Does that seem like something you want to present to your voters? Like, fee you.
No.
Yeah, I found that very stunning. It seemed like all the speeches you could tell, Hillary wanted to make sure she let people know she considered this a victory, but also I'm not going to spend a lot of time on stage. Bernie chewed it up, said it was a virtual tie. Rubio gave a victory speech for third place. It was very strange how everybody was talking in different ways.
Cruz, though, is the one who stays on message the most ruthlessly and never says anything interesting.
More than Rubio?
I think so.
Rubio's very on message, too.
Yeah.
Rubio occasionally says things that reflect that he's an intelligent person with possibly interesting opinions, whereas Cruz just, he seems like an automaton.
I think he's a really intelligent person. I think he's completely locked into the world of right-wing ideas and has never let any thought that wasn't generated by someone within that ecosystem penetrate his mental bubble for his entire life. But within those parameters, I think he's a totally brilliant guy who gets it completely.
Smarter than Rubio?
Yeah, I think so.
And I think you could argue the sigh of relief line was very shrewd if Hillary is remembering what happened in 2012. I mean, Mitt Romney got credit for winning Iowa, and it wasn't until 16 days later that it turned out actually Rick Santorum had won Iowa, and by that time it was way too late to matter. And so she, knowing that it was way too close to call at the point at which she came out, she needed to figure out a way to make it sound as though she was claiming victory without having those actual words come out of her mouth. So her choice of language, I think, was very, very, very carefully considered.
When we talk about stump speeches, obviously for the press who have to cover these things, you hear that Ted Cruz say the same things over and over and over again. Marco Rubio say the same things over and over and over again. Voters aren't paying as close of attention.
Right.
So is the politician right to just hammer it and hammer it and hammer it, and then the press, when the press complains about it, are they not taking into account that most voters mercifully don't have to pay as much attention as poor journalists who have to sit there all the time?
I'd say yes. I mean, yeah, they're targeting it towards the average level of news consumption of their voting public. So I think they're probably doing the right thing.
And I think one of the things, message discipline is valuable. The weird thing is that you've got Trump, who's just a stream of consciousness. You never know what's going to come out of his mouth next, versus Cruz and Rubio. I mean, they're your top three, and they're completely different in that rhetorical style, and yet all those are the top three. So.
Obviously, there's not Martin O'Malley dropping out. There's no support to go anywhere. That seemed meaner than I meant it. With the Republican side, there was still 20% allocated to people outside the top three. Where does that? There's so many of them are what you would consider establishment candidates. Where does that 20% go when they eventually drop out of this race? Is that good news for Rubio? Does he look at that 20% and say that's hopefully for me? Or do the other candidates think that they're going to get it?
Well, the biggest one was Ben Carson. And so, that's got to look like a Cruz voter to Ted Cruz. I mean, that's the closest proxy you can find for a Carson voter. The good and bad for Rubio is that he consolidated the regular establishment vote. That's the good. The bad is that it only got him less than a quarter of the vote in Iowa. So if Iowa was a typical state and you said, okay, this is what the world in which there's no establishment competition for Rubio looks like, well, you're losing real bad. You're getting less than a quarter of the vote. Now, the other side is that Iowa has way more evangelical Christians than a lot of other states outside the South.
So you would say that Cruz then looks at this and says there's 10% for me. Rubio looks and says there's potentially 10% for me. Does Donald Trump, other than people who are voting for Donald Trump now, is he anyone's second choice, do you think? I mean, it seems to me you either are in on Trump or you're out on Trump.
That sounds right to me. He's sort of outside of. He's an outsider. That would be hard to deny. That I think he's like a balloon that is now going to deflate. Because people were for him. They probably didn't even know why. They thought he was cool, and he also was a winner, as he said. And it turns out he's not a winner. So his reason for running is disappeared.
Well, he's also got the strongest support among moderate Republicans. And that's a thing that people really don't realize. He was sort of typecast as some kind of far-right figure, but he's not. At least that's not who he's appealing to. He gets the support of some really strongly anti-immigration Republicans, and some of them are very conservative. So he gets conservative support, but he has more support in the center of the party than he does on the right of the party. So he definitely has more breadth to his appeal than Cruz, and possibly more than Rubio. But as you both say, he also creates lots of enemies, more than those guys do. So you wouldn't necessarily assume that he's super limited.
I mean, he has a disapproval rating of about 60%, but he also has been able to be moving that needle. I mean, I don't think anyone thought back in July that we would have been watching him and living with him and learning about him this long. And so I don't discount the possibility that people's views of him could change.
He was upset that you did not name him Time Person of the Year.
He absolutely was.
He thought that Angela Merkel was not a good pick.
That's correct.
Did he voice that to you?
He and I have discussed that recently, actually.
Politely? A polite conversation?
Very, very politely.
Yes.
And I noted to him that in the entire history of Person of the Year, Time has never named a presidential candidate. And there's a good reason for that. I think voters get understandably pissed off when we jump in line ahead of them. And so I noted that history also suggests that if he actually wins this thing, he's in a pretty sweet position for next year.
Well, you're going to be in trouble when Angela Merkel jumps in as a third-party candidate. We talked backstage a little bit about how the way things are covered now, it could be a moment in a debate that all of a sudden gets picked up as an internet meme, or somebody makes a GIF out of it. Obviously, this is going to happen every 4 years. Technology will change to make covering campaigns different. How much different is this campaign, and what kind of candidates does it help that we live in this age where everything can get parsed into very small pieces that can then get sent out to people via the internet?
Well, I think Trump's campaign headquarters is Twitter and Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and Trump Tower. But it is the power of those platforms for these candidates to work around customary channels, I think, grows more and more evident and really critically important. And so I don't see that becoming less true going forward. And Ted Cruz's technology. Granted, Iowa is such a shoe leather state, but they could tell you on Friday before the caucuses that there are 9,181 voters who are undecided between Trump and Cruz. I mean, down to the corpuscle, they knew where their voters were, which is why they were so calm going into it. And all of that was driven by technology. So I think it's impossible to overstate how much these technologies of channels and platforms and means are changing the way this all plays out.
Can't improve on that answer.
What you talked about just video, how now when somebody's on the campaign trail, there's a better chance, obviously, than ever that something's going to get caught on video. Do you think, looking back at past campaigns, candidates were just so incredibly lucky that didn't exist then?
Sure. And some of them were unlucky when it first came. Howard Dean. I mean, if you look at that clip, it's nothing. And it essentially ruined his candidacy, where he said, nah.
Yeah.
And that was just a noise.
Yeah.
Now it's what was a flub to him is basically Trump's platform. Trump runs around the stage screaming and yelling like that all the time, and people are like, finally, someone's acting the way I want them to act. I mean, it's amazing that's not ancient history with Howard Dean.
Well, the video clip that destroyed George Allen's candidacy is essentially Trump's platform.
There you go. Yeah, that's true. All right, so you have to pick somebody to be on the cover of your magazine this week.
Yes, I do.
Where are you leaning? Do you want some feedback?
I would like you to poll the room because I'm really kind of,
Okay, well, it was safe to say we're going to go with a candidate, though, right?
We don't have to.
Okay.
If anyone thinks that there is something that we know now that we did not know 24 hours ago that is interesting and important, that we should
All right,
be exploring.
who thinks Rubio should be the cover this week of Time Magazine? Trump, Cruz, Hillary, Bernie, Rihanna, New album.
The Zika virus.
The Zika virus. There we go, Zika virus. Oh my God, they're going to be so disappointed when they all find out they're less popular than the Zika virus.
Mosquito. Right.
I guess that's what American politics are today. Thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you, everybody. We really appreciated it. And I think you just have a long day of panels like this, so thanks for your energy and enthusiasm.